What made you end your friendship? The thing that finally ended my friendship with Kevin was dancing. Not money, not a girl, not some big betrayal you could put into a sentence. Dancing. Kevin cannot dance. I need you to understand that up front because everything else only makes sense once you accept it. He is one of the worst dancers I have ever seen in my life, and he is also completely certain he is one of the greatest dancers alive. And those two facts have been at war since we were 13 years old. It started as a funny thing. Music would come on at somebody's place, and Kevin would push into the middle of the floor and start doing whatever it is he does, which is mostly swinging his arms while stepping side to side and biting his bottom lip like he is feeling something the rest of us are too simple to hear. People laughed. Kevin heard applause. He would come off the floor sweating and say, "Did you see them clear space for me, they know?" Nobody was clearing space in awe. They were backing up so his arms would not catch them across the face. For years, I was the one who tried to gently steer him. I would say, "Kevin, maybe ease off a little at other people's events," and he would say, "You're just not on my level. Not everyone can handle this kind of energy." That was the pattern for a decade. I softened him for the world, and I softened the world for him, and I told myself that was what a good friend did. There was a wedding, years back, where he walked onto the floor during the couple's first dance and started doing his thing about 4 feet from the bride. The groom stopped moving and just stared at him. Kevin gave the groom a nod like they were sharing something and kept going. Somebody's grandmother had to be physically relocated out of range of his arms. When I pulled him aside afterward and told him that was their first dance, he said, "I gave them a memory. Years from now, they'll talk about the guy who lit up their wedding." He believed it. That is the part people never understand about Kevin. He was not being a jerk on purpose. He genuinely lived in a world where his presence was a gift and everyone else was just slow to unwrap it. And because nobody ever told him plainly, he kept getting worse. He started warming up before parties. He bought special shoes. He called it his craft. He told me once, dead serious, that he was wasting a gift by not going pro. I asked pro what? He said dancer, performer. People pay to see this. And then he did a spin next to the counter to demonstrate and knocked a glass onto the floor. And then he blamed the glass for being too close to the edge. Every party we went to ran the same way. He would take the floor, clear a radius through sheer danger, and walk off certain he had elevated the evening. If a song ended, he would say they weren't ready for that one. If people were filming, and people did film, he would say, "See, they want to remember this." He thought he was known for talent. He was known for nearly removing a man's eye at a birthday party doing the helicopter next to a shelf of glassware. And every time, I was the one who caught the host afterward and said, "Sorry about that, he means well, he doesn't realize." I said it so many times it stopped being a sentence and became a reflex. There is a specific kind of tiredness that comes from being the person who explains someone else to the world for a decade. You do not notice it building. You just notice one day that you brace before he walks into a room. Then came my engagement party. That was the line, and I did not even know it was a line until he crossed it. Desiree and I had planned a first dance. We practiced it in the living room for 3 weeks, laughing at ourselves, getting it wrong, getting it slightly less wrong. It was our moment in front of every person we loved. The song started, we walked out, and about 30 seconds in, I felt the air in the room change, and there was Kevin sliding onto the floor beside us with the lip bite already going, muscling into the middle of our first dance exactly the way he had done to that poor couple years earlier. Desiree looked at me. I looked at Kevin. He winked at me. At my own engagement party, he winked at me like he was doing me a favor. Then he went for a big spin, lost his footing on the polished floor, and came down sideways into the table with our cake on it. The whole thing went over. Cake, plates, the little topper Desiree's aunt had made by hand, all of it on the floor, and a wide streak of frosting down the side of Desiree's dress. For a second, nobody in that room moved, and Kevin, sitting in the wreckage, looked up and said, "Okay, that part wasn't planned, but tell me the energy wasn't incredible up until then." I told him to leave. He stood up, offended, frosting on his special shoes, and said, "You know what? I try to bring life to your boring events, and this is what I get." He called my engagement party boring. On his way out the door, after destroying it, he never apologized. Not that night, not the next day, not once. I want to be clear about that because it is the load-bearing wall of everything that came after. There was no apology. There was no acknowledgement. There was a week of silence, and then there was a video. A few days before the party, Kevin had signed himself up to audition for an actual competitive dance crew, and he had been telling the whole group about it for weeks, telling us to come watch him make it. When I make this crew, he kept saying, "Don't act surprised." So a bunch of us went, partly out of loyalty and partly because we knew what we were about to witness. Kevin walked in like he owned the building. There were real dancers there, people who could genuinely move, and Kevin looked around at them and said to me, "They should just go home." Honestly, his turn came. The music started. He did the arms, the sidestep, the lip bite, and then he went for the move he calls the helicopter. The judges stopped him at roughly 10 seconds. One of them held up a hand and said, "Thank you, that's enough." Kevin said, "I'm just getting warmed up. The good part is coming." The judge said, "There won't be a good part." And Kevin stood there in front of a room full of strangers and argued with a professional about whether he, Kevin, was secretly gifted, until the judge finally said, "Sir, you cannot dance. Please clear the floor." A kid who could not have been older than 12 went next and was genuinely astonishing. And Kevin muttered on the way out that the kid had an unfair advantage because he was young. 3 days later, my phone buzzed with a video sent to the entire group and a message that read, "You're all going to owe me an apology." It was Kevin in his living room, phone propped on a stack of books, tank top soaked through, dancing to the exact song the judges had cut him off during. He had added moves. There was a new one where both arms went in opposite directions at the same time, like two windmills fighting each other, and he almost took out his own lamp with it. He called it the tsunami. It was the helicopter with more risk, and he was wearing the special shoes, the same ones. I could see the frosting still dried onto them. He had not cleaned them. He had not thrown them out. He was wearing my ruined cake on his feet like it was a championship ring. At the end, he looked into the camera, breathing hard, and said, "The judges were wrong. This is my response tape. I'm sending it to every crew in the state, and when one of them picks me up, every single one of you is going to feel stupid." Then Andre called me. Andre is the friend who keeps things light, who never gets heavy about anything, and his voice was not light. He said, "I love the guy, but he hasn't even apologized to you or Desiree yet." And that was when the shape of it landed on me properly. Kevin had not skipped the apology because he forgot. He had skipped it because in his version of events, there was nothing to apologize for. So I called him. I told myself I would stay calm. I said, "Kevin, we need to talk about the engagement party before anything else." He cut me off and said, "That's old news. I've moved past it. You should too." I said, "You destroyed our cake and you got frosting on Desiree's dress, and you have never once said sorry." And Kevin, without a pause, said, "The cake was in a bad spot. That's a venue problem, not a Kevin problem. A venue problem." He hit a table with his body and blamed the table. I was standing at the counter with the phone against my ear and I felt something close inside me, quietly, like a door in another room. I said, "You need to apologize to Desiree." He laughed. He actually laughed, and he said, "For what? I was the only one bringing energy to that party. You should be thanking me." I hung up. Desiree came in a few minutes later and read the whole thing off my face before I said a word. I told her all of it. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said, calm and level, "I never want him at another one of our events." She was not being dramatic. She had simply arrived somewhere I had not gotten to yet. I told her I understood, but even then, I was not ready to end 15 years over a cake. I told myself he would settle down. I woke up the next morning to 17 notifications. Kevin had posted the response tape everywhere. Our college alumni thread, our pickup basketball group, the neighborhood chat, every group we shared, and in every single one, he tagged me and wrote the same line. My boy's engagement party was where I first debuted the tsunami. Ask him, he saw it live. He was using the worst moment of my engagement party as his origin story. People I had not spoken to in 5 years started messaging me, asking if that was the party where the cake got destroyed. Desiree's mother heard about it secondhand through a family friend in the alumni thread and called Desiree to ask, in these words, whether the wedding was going to be safe from that boy. Desiree got off that call with red eyes. She sat down on the couch and said, "If Kevin is at our wedding, I will walk the other way, and I mean it." I promised her he would not be. What I did not tell her that night was how bad it already was. 2 nights earlier, Kevin had sent Desiree a direct message, the first time in all the years I had known him that he had ever contacted her one-on-one. It did not say sorry. It said, "Hey Desiree, no hard feelings about the cake. These things happen when you're around greatness. LOL. Quick question. What's the reception playlist going to be? I want to make sure my routine matches the vibe." She read it, handed me the phone, and said nothing at all, and the nothing was louder than anything she could have said. I took a screenshot of it. I did not know yet what I was saving it for. I only knew that I had spent 15 years explaining Kevin to other people, and I was finally starting to build a file instead. What I also did not tell her was that Kevin had already been telling people he was in the wedding party. Andre had heard him on the sideline at basketball describing a routine to Gabriel like it was a settled fact, discussing song choice and running time and where he would stand for maximum visibility. Gabriel, who is the quietest person any of us know and who has never started a conflict in his life, pulled Andre aside afterward and said, "I think Kevin genuinely believes he's performing at that wedding. Somebody needs to tell him he isn't invited." So I tried. I took him for coffee. He walked in relaxed and smiling like nothing had ever happened between us. I let him talk about a new move for a minute, and then I set my cup down and said, Kevin, you are not performing at my wedding. You are not dancing at my wedding. And right now, I am not sure you are coming to my wedding. He stared at me, waiting for a punchline, and when it did not come, his face did not go to hurt. It went to a kind of pity. He leaned in and said, you're going to regret that when you see what I have planned. I said, that is exactly what I'm afraid of. And he leaned back and said, you've changed, man. Desiree's got you on a leash. I stood up. I said, don't talk about her. And he waved his hand at me the way he waves off judges and cakes and every consequence he has ever earned and said, relax, you used to be fun. I picked up my keys and left. In the parking lot, I called Andre and told him I had probably just lost a friend I had known since I was 13, and I did not feel sad. I felt lighter, and Andre said, that tells you everything. 2 days after that, the DJ called me. Not Kevin. The DJ. A guy named Terrell that Desiree and I had booked 8 months earlier and paid a deposit to, and he opened with, hey, quick thing. I want to confirm the handoff timing with you directly because it's unusual. I said, what handoff? And Terrell said, your brother's segment. I sat down on the edge of the bed. I told him I do not have a brother. There was a long pause on the other end, the kind where you can hear a man's whole afternoon rearrange itself. Then Terrell said, okay, I'm going to forward you everything. What came through 20 minutes later is the reason this story has an ending. Kevin had pulled Terrell's number off our public registry page. He had called him, introduced himself as my brother, and told him he was coordinating a surprise on my behalf. He had sent a deposit of his own money to reserve a 7-minute block after dinner. He had specified 3 costume changes, and in the last message, the one I read 4 times standing at the foot of my own bed, he had asked Terrell to fade our first dance song out at the 45-second mark and hand him the microphone because, in his words, the front of the night should belong to the strongest performer in the room. He was not planning to dance at my wedding. He was planning to cut short the first dance between me and my wife so that he could take the floor instead. He had put money down on it. He had put it in writing. I read the thread 3 times on the edge of that bed, and the strangest part was how ordinary the messages were. Polite, even. Organized. He had attached a timing sheet. He had listed the costume changes by number. This was not a man having an impulse at a party. This was weeks of quiet, careful planning aimed directly at 4 minutes that belonged to me and my wife, executed by a person who was, at the same time, sitting across a coffee shop table calling her a leash. Terrell asked me on that call whether he should cancel the block. I told him to leave everything exactly where it was and not to answer any more of Kevin's messages. And he said, understood, and I could hear in his voice that he had figured out roughly what kind of week I was having. And Kevin had done all of it while telling me to my face that I was going to regret not seeing what he had planned. I did not call him. I did not post anything. I did not say a word to anyone for 3 days because our friend group has a monthly dinner, and that dinner was on Thursday, and I wanted the people who had watched me carry Kevin for 15 years to be in the room when I set him down. I told Andre. I told Gabriel. Gabriel was quiet for a while and then said, I've wanted to say something for 2 years and never wanted to be the one to start it, but somebody has to. Kevin, meanwhile, was in the group chat like a man without a single worry in his life, sending clips of himself practicing in his garage, calling it training, and then 2 days before the dinner, sending a message that said, big announcement Thursday, you're all going to lose it. He showed up to that dinner last in brand new dance sneakers, carrying a small portable speaker under his arm like a briefcase. He set it on the table and said, I brought a visual aid. We had barely gotten drinks before he stood up and tapped his glass with a fork like a man about to accept an award. He said, I've been working on something and I want you all to hear it from me first, and then he held up his phone. He had made a flyer, an actual designed flyer, with fonts and colors and a photo of himself in a pose that I think was meant to look powerful, but mostly looked like a man recovering his balance on ice. Across the top, it said Kevin's Wedding Showcase, and underneath that, it had my name and Desiree's name, printed on a document I had never seen and never approved, with Kevin listed as featured performer and choreographer and a QR code at the bottom. He said he had already sent it to people. The table went completely silent, and Kevin read that silence as anticipation, and he started laying out details like a man pitching a business plan, 7 minutes, 3 costume changes, and then he said, I talked to the DJ already, he's on board, and I said, out loud, calmly, I know. Kevin blinked. It was the first time all night his script did not have the next line ready. I took out my phone. I said, Terrell called me Tuesday. He called me because you told him you were my brother. Kevin's hand came off the speaker. I said, you sent him a deposit out of your own account to reserve 7 minutes at my reception, and I read the number out. I said, you gave him a costume change schedule for a wedding you were not invited to. And then I read the last message word for word, including the part where he asked a man Desiree and I had hired and paid to fade out our first dance at 45 seconds and hand him the microphone because the front of the night should belong to the strongest performer in the room. I put the phone face up in the middle of the table so anyone who wanted to read it could. Nobody picked it up. Nobody needed to. Andre had gone very still. Gabriel was looking at Kevin with an expression I had never seen on him. And Kevin, who had spent 15 years surviving on the fact that nobody could ever prove what he had actually intended, sat in front of 6 people who were now reading his intentions in his own words. Timestamp. He said, that's out of context. I said, it's the whole message. He said, it was a surprise. You don't ask permission for a surprise. And Andre, who never raises his voice, said, you don't buy 7 minutes of another man's wedding. Kevin. Kevin looked around the table for someone to rescue him, the way he always had, and there was nobody. He tried to laugh and said, all right, save the speech for the best man toast, and the laugh landed in the room and died there. I said, you're not the best man. You're not in the wedding party. And after this, you're not coming. He said, what are you talking about? And for once, he was not performing confusion. He was actually confused, and that was somehow worse. So I said all of it. I went through the engagement party, the first dance, the cake, the frosting on the dress, the boring comment on his way out the door. He said, I said I was sorry about the cake, and Andre said, no, you didn't. Not once. And Kevin looked around for a single person to back that up and found nothing but people looking at their plates. I went through the audition and the judge. I went through the response tape and the shoes he never cleaned. I went through every group chat he posted it in with my name tag. I went through the message he sent Desiree, the one that called the destruction of her dress a thing that happens when you're around greatness. And I told him she had not laughed at it. She had just handed me the phone and said nothing because there was nothing to say. And then Gabriel spoke and the room turned because Gabriel does not speak. He said, Kevin, I've known you a long time and you're a good person, but you can't dance. You really can't. And the way you keep forcing yourself into other people's moments, that isn't a gift. That's selfish. Kevin stared at him like he had been struck, not angry, stunned in the way you only get when the blow comes from the direction you never guard. He stood up. The chair scraped hard against the floor. He grabbed his speaker and his phone and held them against his chest like they had to be protected from us. And he said, so this is what this is? An intervention? You all got together to tear me down. I said, no. I said, I came here to say it to your face instead of just disappearing on you, because 15 years is worth that much. But you tried to cut my first dance with my wife in half so you could take the floor, and you paid money to do it. He said, you would have thanked me. And I believe he meant it. He walked toward the door and stopped halfway there and turned around and said, you're all going to look back and realize you had somebody special in your corner, and you pushed him away. Then he opened the door and said, and for the record, the helicopter is fire, and you all know it, and he left. Nobody spoke for a while. Gabriel eventually said quietly, that went about how I expected. Andre put a hand on my shoulder and left it there and did not say anything at all, which was the right call. My phone buzzed on the table once. It was Kevin. It said, you'll regret this when I make it. I turned it face down. 3 months later, we got married. The first dance ran the full length of the song, all 4 minutes of it, and nobody slid onto the floor, and nothing got knocked over. And when it ended, the applause was for us. Terrell refunded Kevin's deposit the week after that dinner. I know because he told me, and because he also told me Kevin called twice more to argue about it. I have not spoken to Kevin since he walked out of that restaurant, and I do not plan to. Sometimes I still think about the version of him that could have existed, the one who would have called the morning after the cake and said, I am so sorry, tell me how to fix it. That man was never in there. Last I heard, he still practices in his garage every night with the door rolled halfway up. The frosting-stained sneakers sit on the shelf above him, laces still tied, waiting for a floor that is never going to clear. What made you end your friendship? The thing that finally ended my friendship with Kevin was dancing. Not money, not a girl, not some big betrayal you could put into a sentence. Dancing. Kevin cannot dance.